Oh, hello. Welcome to the 2013 Hundie Challenge. Today we're going to be discussing Howard the Duck by Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends. Dee-doo-dee-doo-doo, dee-doo-dee-doo-dee-doo-dee-doo-doo, dee-doo-dee-doo-doo, dee-doo-dee-doo-dee-doo-doo-doo. Thanks for tuning in this week. I just read A Room with a View last week, and gave me a pretty good opinion of E.M. Forster. And pretty much what I said in that video is how I feel about Howard's End. There was something new that I noticed about Howard's End that struck me a couple of times. It's not real overt, what I'm about to say. But I'm a big fan of Douglas Adams and, Monty Python and kind of that late 20th century kind of British humor. And what I noticed in this book was there were a couple times when I was like, that's the kind of line that Douglas Adams would have written. Here, I'll give you an example. I had to look this up just now. Okay, so here's the line. He's talking about a photograph. It represented a young lady called Jackie and had been taken at the time when young ladies called Jackie were often photographed with their mouths open. That's just kind of a little bit of a funny way of saying, oh, the photograph had the girl with her mouth open, but it's such a weird humorous British construction that, I hate to overstate the case because obviously this is a relatively serious book, but I can almost see a direct, I can almost see E.M. Forster as a direct ancestor of Douglas Adams in terms of their style. Now, this book in particular, Howard's End, was a little longer, a little drearier, and a little deeper than A Room with a View. I'll go into something else about that later, about whether I would have read it or not. Because there's not a whole lot about this book that I didn't already cover in A Room with a View. So if you watch that video, you kind of have a general idea of how I feel about this author. Maybe Passage to India will be different. We'll find out when we get to that. But what this book was very interesting to me for a book written a century ago, I think it's 1908, 1910, something like that, is how unusually politically progressive it is. Even A Room with a View, although it's about a woman and kind of about women's rights, and Old Wives' Tale, almost not at all. And this whole kind of this genre, this oeuvre that I was talking about in the last video, or two videos ago about this time period, is how everyone's kind of, worried about their status and their place in society and that kind of thing. Howard's End is almost about the war between the sexes, because in the end, Howard's End, for the two sisters that are kind of the main characters of this story, it becomes a symbol of, it almost becomes like a fortress for them against the male patriarchy, and they kind of desperately want to hole up in Howard's End just for a night, they said, just for a night when we could have no men and not let any men in there, because the one sister, spoiler alert on your century-old book, the one sister becomes pregnant in the end, and there are certain expectations of her because of the time period, and why wasn't she married to the father, and this sort of thing. And the other sister said, well, fuck it. We're women, we're this close to having suffrage, why can't we live with our sister and, raise my nephew, together with the mother. And he also goes into, which I'd have to double check, but I don't think A Room with a View, well, there were different classes, but Howard's End was much more specifically about the poor versus the rich. And the two wealthy sisters kind of give some bad stock advice to a very poor guy that they're trying to help. And so it's kind of about how the rich play with money, while for the poor, what little money they can scrape together. This guy Leonard Bast, who is, he doesn't sound especially poor. He's not even really middle class, maybe, but he's definitely a lower class than the Schlegel sisters. And the Schlegel sisters just kind of play with money, and they play with him, and they kind of don't really think all that hard about where their next meal is coming from. And I think the symbol that Forster kept using throughout was the rich. It's like they're standing in an ocean on two islands of gold, 1 foot on each island, while everybody else is either paddling or, trying to get up onto an island. And it kind of actually delved into what it was like for, the rich just kind of flippantly at that time. And, it's not like it's entirely changed. Just, don't think that hard about how what they do and what's nothing to them is, something to a poorer person, like Leonard Bast. And and with the Battle of the Sexes, there's a really direct comparison between Henry Wilcox, who ends up marrying one of the Schlegel sisters, who had an affair, and I forget who, I think it was Helen was the one that got pregnant. She also had an affair, but because he was a man and she was a woman, she was going to be a ruined woman because she got pregnant and didn't get married. And so, her life was over. Her life in society was over. Whereas Wilcox, who did the same transgression, the same crime at that time, he could just go on with his life. It was no big deal. So it was interesting how politically minded it was. But for all that, this is already going a little longer than I thought it would go with this discussion here. But I did want to brush on a point in general about this challenge that I set for myself to read, the 100 books this year, which is, would I have read book XYZ? Would I have actually read it all the way through if I wasn't participating in this challenge? And interestingly, I think if I had picked up A Room with a View, I would have kept reading it and kept finishing it. But I think if I had picked up Howard's End, I would not have. Because it was such a slow burn. And there's a payoff. Don't get me wrong. He spent a long time setting up the pieces, putting the chess pieces together. And then there is a payoff at the end. Whereas A Room with a View kind of kept you reading and kept stringing you along. So we'll talk about that a little more in the future. But that is one point that I've had in mind with a lot of these books. Would I have read it if it wasn't on this list? Would I have gotten through it? Was it worth it to read it? So thanks for tuning in. Next time we will be talking about F. Scott Fitzgerald, Tender as the Night.